Imagine sitting alone at the very back of a B-17 bomber, 25,000 feet above enemy territory, with a German fighter racing toward you at 400 miles per hour. Most tail gunners barely hit anything. But when Gunner built a crazy mirror system and tripled his accuracy, they left at him until enemy fighters started falling from the sky. During the Second World War, aerial combat evolved at a speed that often outpaced the technology designed to support it. Aircraft became faster, weapons more powerful, and missions more dangerous with each passing year. Among the most iconic machines of this era was the American B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy bomber built to strike deep into enemy territory during daylight hours. Designed with multiple defensive machine guns and a rugged airframe, the B-17 symbolized American industrial strength and strategic ambition. Yet, despite its fearsome reputation, the aircraft and its crew faced constant danger, especially from enemy fighters attacking from the rear. The tail of the B-17 was both its shield and its vulnerability. German fighter pilots quickly learned that attacking from behind offered the greatest chance of success. Approaching from the bomber's blind spots, using speed and altitude to their advantage, they could unleash devastating fire before the defensive gunners had time to respond effectively. This made the tail gunner one of the most critical crew members on the aircraft. His performance could mean the difference between survival and destruction, not just for himself, but for every man on board. The position of tail gunner was physically and psychologically brutal. Isolated at the very end of the aircraft, the gunner sat in a cramped compartment exposed to extreme cold and constant vibration. At operational altitudes of over 25,000 feet, temperatures often dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was scarce, frost formed on equipment, and even simple movements became exhausting. At the same time, the gunner had to remain alert for long periods, scanning the sky for tiny specks that might suddenly transform into deadly enemy fighters. Beyond the physical hardships, the technical challenge of the job was immense. Air combat happened at closing speeds that could exceed 500 miles per hour when the relative velocities of both aircraft were combined. In such conditions, a gunner could not simply aim directly at an approaching enemy. By the time bullets reached their target, the aircraft would already have moved. This meant the gunner had to aim not where the enemy was, but where it would be in the future. This process, known as deflection shooting, required judgment and an intuitive grasp of complex geometry. Early in the war, most tail gunners received only limited training in deflection shooting. Classroom instruction and practice on static ranges could not fully replicate the chaos of real combat. As a result, hit rates were extremely low. Studies conducted by the U.S. Army Air Forces suggested that only 2 to 3% of rounds fired by defensive gunners actually struck enemy aircraft. This alarming statistic explained the heavy losses suffered by bomber formations during the early years of daylight bombing over Europe. The problem was not a lack of bravery or effort. Tail gunners fought with extraordinary courage, often continuing to fire even as enemy bullets tore through the tail section around them. The real limitation was human perception. The brain is not naturally equipped to calculate precise lead angles while simultaneously compensating for vibration, aircraft movement, changing distances, and the stress of imminent death. Traditional iron sights and Gunsights offered only minimal assistance, forcing gunners to rely heavily on instinct and guesswork. It was in these conditions that when tail gunner began to question the assumptions behind traditional aiming methods. Rather than accepting that deflection shooting had to be a purely mental exercise, he wondered whether the problem could be solved visually. If the future position of the target could somehow be represented directly to the eye, the gunner might not need to calculate anything at all. Aiming could become a matter of perception rather than mathematics. This idea did not emerge from a laboratory or a design office. It arose in the cold, noisy, and dangerous environment of an operational bomber squadron. The gunner observed how enemy fighters appeared to move relative to the bomber and noticed that small changes in perspective made their motion easier to understand. From this observation came a radical thought: mirrors might be used to manipulate perception in a useful way. Using whatever materials were available, the gunner began experimenting with small mirrors mounted inside the tail compartment. These were not precision optical instruments, but simple reflective surfaces salvaged or improvised from available equipment. He positioned them at specific angles around the gun mount so that he could see reflected images of the sky behind him alongside his direct view. When an enemy fighter approached, it appeared both in reality and in reflection, creating a dynamic visual relationship between the two images. This arrangement produced an unexpected effect. As the fighter moved, the reflected image shifted at a different apparent rate than the direct view. This exaggeration of motion made it easier for the gunner to sense the aircraft's trajectory and speed. Without consciously thinking about lead angles, he could instinctively align his guns based on the relative movement of the images. The mirror system effectively translated complex motion into a simple visual cue. At first, the idea was met with skepticism and ridicule. Other crew members referred to the setup as strange, unprofessional, and even ridiculous. In the rigidly standardized environment of military aviation, unofficial modifications were often viewed with suspicion. The mirrors looked out of place among the standardized equipment of the B-17, and few believed they could make a meaningful difference in combat. However, combat quickly provided its own evaluation. On missions where the mirror system was used, the gunner began scoring more hits. Enemy fighters were struck more frequently, broke off attacks sooner, or avoided the tail position altogether. Reports and crew observations confirmed that something had changed. The increase in effectiveness was not subtle. In some cases, hit rates appeared to have tripled compared to earlier missions. This improvement had immediate tactical consequences. German pilots relied on predictable weaknesses in bomber defenses. When those weaknesses began to disappear, their attack patterns had to change. Even the perception that tail gunners were becoming more accurate forced enemy fighters to spend less time in firing positions, reducing their own effectiveness. For bomber crews, every second an enemy fighter hesitated or broke away increased the chances of survival. Equally important was the psychological effect on the gunner himself. Confidence plays a critical role in combat performance. When gunners felt that their shots had a real chance of hitting the enemy, they fired more decisively and with better timing. The mirror system reduced hesitation and uncertainty, allowing the gunner to focus entirely on the engagement rather than on mental calculations. This confidence reinforced the system's effectiveness, creating a positive feedback loop. Despite these results, the mirror system never became official equipment across the B-17 fleet. Military organizations are often slow to adopt unconventional ideas, especially those that are difficult to standardize or explain scientifically. However, the underlying principle did not go unnoticed. Engineers and weapons designers recognized that the gunner's innovation addressed a fundamental limitation of human perception and offered a glimpse of a better solution. In the years that followed, this principle would influence the development of more advanced gunsights. Sights and mechanisms were designed to present gunners and pilots with visual cues that represented future target positions. Instead of forcing the operator to perform mental calculations, the technology performed those calculations automatically and displayed the result in an intuitive way. The crazy mirror system, though crude, embodied the same philosophy. The story of this innovation highlights untruth about technological progress in wartime. Breakthroughs do not always come from formal research programs or high-level planning. Sometimes they emerge from individuals confronting immediate problems with creativity and courage. In the frozen tale of a B-17 Flying Fortress, when gunners and conventional thinking quietly reshaped the way aerial combat was understood.